Methods and return values. So we're going to take the parameters that we did in 3.2 and layer one more thing on top of it. Let's take a look at the slides, see how they've changed. You can take in parameters. We already know that. That's what goes in the parentheses. These are what goes into the methods. These are our inputs to our function. And it can give back results as return values. So when we're printing stuff, that's technically not a return value. That's just you printing something. Returns can be passed. That's when we're using a method as an input, like in that last read input in the echo exercise from 3.2. That was the input method. Read input's a method technically behind the scenes. So now we're going to return it rather than print it. So we could use that as an input. All we do is, instead of a system.out.println, we have a return total here, and our second word, instead of void, now we have an int. So private int, this tells us what we want to return. This could be anything. When we get into objects, you'll be making objects. You could return an object, and we will be returning objects. But for now, we're going to be returning ints, chars, our primitives, strings, our very first object that we're working with. And that's about all we'll do up until unit 4. So let's take a look at the rest of the slide. So here's our inputs, 5 and 8, our A and B, or first and second, and our output is our return value. Slightly different for printing it. I know it kind of seems the same for now, but we can't pass a print statement as a parameter to a new method. So look, we would pass that to a new variable total. Assigning a value with a void method. See, this won't work because we're just printing a line out rather than returning it. Void means it's returning nothing. What's a void? An empty space. So we're returning an empty space, meaning we're returning nothing. Add 1. This will return 1 more than x. Return x plus 1. We don't actually need to write like a variable to do the math. We could just simply return one line. We're assigning the add 1 value to y by passing a variable into it, or here we're just putting the value in ourselves. Double number, this will double it. How do you double a number? You multiply it by 2. So here's how we define it. They did it on 2 lines. You could just do 2 times x here. You have private. We'll stick with private for a while. Int, because we're going to return an int, and then we double that number. I feel like it's silly to use double when we're using that as a data type as well. Int doubled x is this, and then we return that variable. This is the return statement. Calling a method with return value. Well, we have the int num5, and then we're declaring another variable to hold the answer of double num with that variable passed in. So let's back up one sec. This is the parameter, which means it expects an integer to be passed into it. In the code, we'll use x for that variable, but over here, we're passing in the variable num as our x. So behind the scenes, it takes that num, does math on it as x, so we'll do 2 times x, where x equals 5, and we get 10 out. Method signature is the name and the parameter list, so that's what we use in our run block. And finally, we have visibility. Don't worry about that for a while. Return type, what it's actually returning. The name of the method. So what would you get if you squared x? The square of x. And the parameter list. Take a look at the assignments. Don't blink. These goes pretty quick. The first one, I think they do 4 of it. It was one of the example video. This takes an input parameter, x, and returns 2 times that. Square. I think they have it blank. They don't. So we know we're going to return an integer because it's written there. So we're going to return something that's an integer type. When we do math, we kind of do it as an integer by default unless we cast it. So we're going to take x. How do we square a number? Multiply it by ourselves. So the only thing this differs from that last assignment is one of the 2 is now an x as well. I feel like my editor shrank. This one, they didn't write anything for us at all. We have to do it ourselves. And they do introduce the scratchpad as well. I I wrote a little bit of code in there. Let's see if that's not by default, right? You can see down here the answer, but we'll go through writing it by ourselves. Oh no, they put the answer in there. That's very interesting. So that's one way to introduce the scratchpad. Scratchpad, it essentially lets us test our code. So I'm passing this method to system that out println here. But let's write it ourselves first. So, and then we'll go through the scratchpad too. Private, we always start with private. We're going to return a double, I believe. Takes two doubles, returns two doubles. So return a double. Average, we're calling it average. Because behind the scenes, it's going to run our method and expecting it to be called average. We pass it two doubles. We could call these pretty much anything we want. You would just have to use those names inside your code in the method. Keep it short and simple, I guess, for methods, because we would comment it to tell what that method is going to be doing. How do we take the average of two numbers? We add them, we divide them. We've taken more complicated averages before, so consider how you would write a method that returned the average of a bunch of inputs. So back over on the scratchpad, we do have some test cases for our code, which tests are unit tests. These are called unit tests. Essentially, they're particular cases we've written to see if our code's working properly. Some of them can include edge cases and so forth. So they kind of print out the result here, but in the scratchpad, this is where we could practice. See, this is the same method we already wrote, but if we want to test that before we submit it, we would have to run it here. Some of the future exercises will have hidden test cases, so if you want to test it to see what's going on, you have to run it here. System.out.println, we call the method average. Remember, that's the signature name of the method plus the inputs, and then it's going to print these out. We have to run the print because returning it's going to return a number that it prints. If we just run it without the print, nothing will print out. So now we're only going to see two print lines. I got rid of semicolon. So even worse, we saw nothing. We saw two print lines. Okay, that's it for the scratchpad and a square lesson. Let's take a look at we already submitted that. Just didn't turn green. That's it for methods.